The fluorescent lights of room 412 hummed quietly above her as Sarah Whitman lay in the hospital bed, her newborn daughter resting against her chest for the very first time. Her hair was damp with sweat, her hands trembling from exhaustion, but her eyes were wide open, fixed on the tiny face she had waited 9 months to see. Outside that door in a conference room 4 floors below, a team of lawyers in tailored suits were shaking hands and pouring champagne. The deal Sarah had spent 6 years building in secret had just closed. $1.5 billion, and her name was on every page of it. But Sarah wasn't thinking about money in that moment. She was thinking about survival, about the long night behind her, about the small life now breathing softly in her arms. She had no idea that the two biggest moments of her life were happening under the very same roof, at the very same hour, and that only one of them was about to walk through her door. At 9:47 that morning, the door to room 412 opened, and David Whitman stepped inside. He was not wearing scrubs. He was not carrying flowers, or a stuffed animal, or even a smile. He was wearing his charcoal gray suit, the one he saved for board meetings and depositions. And in his right hand, he carried a thick manila envelope. Sarah looked up at him, still cradling their daughter, still glowing from a labor that had nearly broken her body in half, and for a brief moment she smiled. She thought he had come to meet his daughter. She thought he had come to tell her he was proud. Instead, David walked to the foot of the bed, set the envelope down beside her feet, and said 4 words that would replay in Sarah's mind for the rest of her life. "I want a divorce." The monitors kept beeping. The baby kept sleeping. And Sarah Whitman somehow did not cry. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What David did not know, what he could not have possibly known standing in that hospital room with his lawyer's envelope in hand, was that his wife was no longer the woman he married. The contract that had closed downstairs that morning was not a small business deal or a minor consulting fee. It was the culmination of every late night Sarah had spent hiding her laptop screen when he walked into the room, at every business trip she had quietly rescheduled around his golf weekends, every ounce of ambition she had learned to shrink in front of him because his ego could not survive the idea that she might outgrow him. For 6 years, Sarah had built something extraordinary in the spaces between his attention, and now, on the very morning their daughter was born, the two halves of her hidden life had collided. One man was about to learn that his timing could not have been worse. One woman was about to learn that her timing could not have been better. And neither of them yet understood just how much that single morning was about to cost. By the end of this story, you will understand exactly why Sarah Whitman did not break down in that hospital bed. You will understand why, instead of tears, a slow and quiet smile spread across her face as she looked up at the man who thought he held all the power in that room. Because David Whitman had just made the single greatest miscalculation of his entire life, and he had made it in front of a stack of papers he never bothered to read closely enough. To understand how a man could walk into a hospital room and serve his wife divorce papers minutes after she gave birth, you first have to understand who these two people really were, and more importantly, who they were pretending to be. Sarah Whitman was 34 years old, a quiet, methodical woman who had spent the better part of a decade building a company most people in her own family did not fully understand. David Whitman was 37, the son of old money, a man who had grown up believing that success was something you inherited, not something you built. For 6 years, they had presented themselves to the world as a happy couple. Dinner parties, holiday photos, a beautiful home in a neighborhood where everyone smiled and almost no one was honest. But underneath that surface, something had been quietly unraveling for a very long time. Here is what we know for certain. On the morning their daughter was born, Sarah Whitman closed a business deal worth $1.5 billion. On that same morning, David Whitman filed for divorce. The question that should be sitting in your mind right now is not simply how this happened. It is why David chose that exact moment, of all the moments in their 6 years together, to end his marriage. Was it coincidence? Was it cruelty? Or was David walking into a trap that had been carefully built long before that morning, one he never even knew existed? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, the one we will spend the rest of this story answering. If David truly believed he was blindsiding his wife, why did Sarah already know exactly what was in that envelope before he ever set it down? Sarah Whitman grew up in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, the daughter of a school teacher and a man who repaired engines for a living. She was the first person in her family to graduate college, and she did it on scholarships and night shifts at a coffee shop near campus. Friends from those years describe her the same way, again and again. Quiet, but never passive. Sarah was the kind of woman who listened more than she spoke, who watched people carefully, and who almost never showed her hand until she was certain of the outcome. She studied design and business, and by the time she was 26, she had already filed 2 patents for a manufacturing process that would later become the foundation of her company. She had no family money behind her, no safety net, just an idea, a relentless work ethic, and a quiet, burning belief that she was building something the world did not yet know it needed. David Whitman could not have come from a more different world. He was raised in Greenwich, Connecticut, in a household where his last name opened doors before he ever had to knock. His father ran a private equity firm. His mother sat on the boards of 3 different charitable foundations. David attended the right schools, wore the right clothes, and from a very young age, he learned that confidence could substitute for competence as long as you said things loudly enough and smiled at the right moments. He was charming. People who met him in those early years often said the same thing. David Whitman could walk into a room and make you feel like the only person in it. That charm was real, but so was something else underneath it, something that would take Sarah years to fully see. They met at a fundraising gala in Manhattan, the kind of event where Sarah normally would not have set foot, except that one of her early investors had insisted she attend to make connections. David approached her within the first 20 minutes of the night. He later told friends he was drawn to her stillness, the way she stood at the edge of the room observing everyone, instead of performing for them. Sarah, for her part, who was drawn to his confidence, the easy way he moved through a world that still felt foreign and intimidating to her. Within 8 months, they were engaged. Within 14 months, they were married in a small ceremony that Sarah's mother cried through from start to finish. In the early years, by every outward measure, the marriage worked. David supported Sarah's ambitions, at least in the way that costs a man nothing. He attended her early pitch meetings. He told her investors she was the smartest person he had ever met. But friends who were close to the couple during this period noticed something subtle, something that took years to fully name. David's support always seemed to come with an unspoken expectation that Sarah's success would remain small enough not to threaten his own sense of importance. And when her company secured its first major contract in year 3, David celebrated for exactly one night before quietly suggesting she hire a CEO so she could, in his words, focus on what actually matters. Sarah smiled, nodded, and kept working. She had already learned by then the first rule of her marriage. Visible ambition made David uncomfortable, so she simply stopped letting him see how far she was actually going. What David did not know was that Sarah's company had quietly caught the attention of one of the largest manufacturing conglomerates in the country by year 4. Negotiations began in complete secrecy, structured deliberately around non-disclosure agreements that Sarah insisted on, partly for legal reasons and partly, if we're being honest, because she had stopped trusting her own husband with information that mattered. She told colleagues she simply did not want to jinx anything by talking about it too soon. But people who knew her best understood there was more to it than superstition. Sarah had begun protecting her work from David the same way you protect something fragile from someone who has shown you, again and again, that they don't know how to hold it gently. And then, in the spring of that same year, everything Sarah believed about her marriage quietly came apart, though David never knew she had discovered it. While reviewing a calendar sync error on a shared family account, Sarah found a string of messages between David and a woman named Claire Donovan, a junior associate at his father's firm. The messages were not ambiguous. They spanned months, and they referenced hotel rooms in Boston and an anniversary dinner David had told Sarah he missed because of a work emergency. Sarah read every single message twice. She did not confront him that night. She did not cry, at least not in front of anyone. Instead, she closed her laptop, sat in the dark of her home office for nearly 2 hours, and began to think with the same cold clarity she brought to every business decision she had ever made about exactly what she was going to do next and exactly when she was going to do it. There is a scene from earlier in their marriage that friends of Sarah's would later describe as the moment they first sensed something was quietly wrong, long before anyone knew about Claire Donovan or the deal taking shape behind closed doors. It happened at a dinner party in their third year of marriage, when hosted by one of David's old college friends. Sarah, a few glasses of wine into the evening, had begun describing, with visible excitement, a new partnership her company was exploring. Halfway through her sentence, David reached over, squeezed her hand, and gently redirected the conversation toward a story about his own work, smiling the entire time, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Nobody at that table seemed to notice. Sarah noticed. She would later tell Patricia Reyes that it was in that exact moment, watching David's hand close over hers, that she first understood her ambition was something he could tolerate only as long as it stayed quiet enough not to compete with his own. What makes this detail so important is what Sarah did with it. She did not raise it with David that night or even that month. Instead, she began, it almost imperceptibly, building a second life alongside her marriage, one David was never fully invited into. She started taking client calls from her car instead of her home office. She began describing major milestones to him in vague, minimized language, telling him a contract was still pretty small, when it was, in fact, the largest her company had signed to date. Friends who worked closely with Sarah during this period describe a woman who was, in every professional sense, fearless, and who had simultaneously become almost invisible inside her own marriage by design. It was not weakness. It was a strategy Sarah would not fully understand the value of until years later, when that same instinct to protect her work from David's reach would end up protecting an entire fortune. In the months that followed her discovery, Sarah Whitman did something that would have surprised almost everyone who thought they knew her. She did not leave. She did not confront David. She did not hire a divorce attorney out of anger, the way most people do in the raw, wounded days after learning the truth about a spouse. Instead, she went quiet in a very specific, very deliberate way. She began meeting with a family law attorney named Patricia Reyes, a woman known in Manhattan legal circles for handling complex, high-asset divorces involving entrepreneurs and inherited wealth. Sarah told Patricia everything: the affair, the messages, the years of being quietly diminished in her own marriage. And then she told Patricia something that made the attorney sit back in her chair. Sarah did not want to file yet. She wanted to wait. And the reason Sarah wanted to wait had everything to do with a document she and David had signed 6 years earlier, on the advice of David's father, before their wedding. It was a prenuptial agreement, drafted almost entirely to protect the Whitman family's inherited wealth in the event the marriage ended. At the time, Sarah had barely read it. She had nothing to protect back then. She owned nothing of significant value, and the idea of the agreement applying to her in any meaningful way seemed almost laughable. But Patricia Reyes read that prenup line by line, and what she found inside it would become the single most important detail in this entire story. The agreement was written in broad, general language about separate property remaining separate, and assets acquired independently during the marriage remaining the sole property of whichever spouse created them. David's lawyers all those years ago had been thinking exclusively about his family's trust funds and real estate holdings. Nobody in that room, 6 years earlier, had imagined a scenario where Sarah would be the one walking away with the fortune. While Sarah quietly prepared, her company's negotiations with the manufacturing conglomerate intensified. By the time she discovered she was pregnant, the deal was already deep into due diligence, with lawyers on both sides working toward a final agreement projected to close sometime in the coming months. Sarah made a decision during this period that she would later describe to a close friend as the hardest and clearest decision of her life. While she would keep working through her pregnancy, she would keep the deal moving forward, and she would say absolutely nothing to David about either the affair she had uncovered or the fortune that was quietly taking shape, because she now understood something about her husband that she hadn't fully accepted before. David Whitman, given the truth too early, would either try to control the outcome or attempt to leave first on his own terms, and Sarah was no longer willing to let him control anything about her future. Meanwhile, David's relationship with Claire Donovan had deepened in ways he believed were entirely hidden from his wife. By the time Sarah was 7 months pregnant, David had already begun discreetly discussing apartments with Claire, telling her that his marriage to Sarah had been over emotionally for years, asking that he simply needed the right moment to walk away cleanly. David told himself a very convenient story during this period, one that many unfaithful spouses tell themselves. He believed Sarah's pregnancy was, financially speaking, a kind of insurance for her. He assumed that once their child was born, Sarah would be far too consumed with motherhood and far too dependent on the comfortable life he provided to fight him aggressively in a divorce. David believed he held every advantage. He believed timing was on his side. He had absolutely no idea that the timing he thought he controlled had already been quietly seized out of his hands months earlier. During this same stretch of months, David and Claire had begun discussing their future with a level of detail that suggested David genuinely believed his exit from the marriage would be simple. He told Claire, according to messages later reviewed by Sarah's legal team, that Sarah had, quote, basically checked out of being ambitious since the pregnancy, a claim that could not have been further from the truth, but one that conveniently allowed David to frame his own betrayal as a reasonable response to a wife who had supposedly lost her drive. Claire, who worked alongside David's father and had every reason to take David's account of his marriage at face value, had no way of knowing that the woman David described as having checked out was at that very moment 3 weeks away from closing the largest deal in her company's history. Sarah's legal preparation during this period was, by every account from those involved, remarkably thorough for someone simultaneously running a company and preparing for the birth of her first child. Patricia Reyes later described Sarah as one of the most organized clients she had worked with in 20 years of family law, noting that Sarah arrived at every meeting with documents already sorted, questions already written out, and a clear sense of exactly what outcome she was working toward. Sarah was not interested in punishing David financially beyond what she was already legally entitled to keep. She told Patricia, more than once, that her only goal was to ensure nothing about her company, her work, or her daughter's future would ever be vulnerable to a man who had shown her, repeatedly, that he could not be trusted with the truth. When in the final weeks of Sarah's pregnancy, the deal with the manufacturing conglomerate reached its final stage. The closing date was set, almost unbelievably, for the same week Sarah's doctors projected she would give birth. Sarah's legal and business teams offered to delay the closing by 2 or 3 weeks, given the obvious complications of timing. Sarah told them, calmly and firmly, to proceed exactly as scheduled. Patricia Reyes, who by now understood far more about Sarah's marriage than David could have imagined, quietly prepared the divorce filing alongside the business closing, ready to be filed the moment Sarah gave the word. Nobody but Sarah, her attorney, and a small circle of trusted advisors knew that 2 of the biggest events of her life had been deliberately engineered to land in the very same week. When on the morning Sarah went into labor, David was, in fact, already at his lawyer's office. But he was not there because he suspected anything about Sarah's business dealings. He had decided, independently and somewhat impulsively, that the arrival of the baby created urgency of its own. He told his attorney he wanted the divorce filed and served as quickly as possible before what he called, quote, the emotional complications of a newborn made the process harder for him to control. David believed he was the one creating urgency. He believed he was the one forcing the issue on his own terms. He had absolutely no idea that several floors below the hospital room, where his wife was about to give birth, a separate team of lawyers were finalizing the largest financial transaction of her life. A transaction his own father's prenuptial agreement had unintentionally guaranteed would belong entirely to her. Let's return now to room 412, because what happened in the minutes after David set that envelope down deserves to be understood in full. Sarah did not scream. She did not ask him to leave. She simply looked down at the envelope sitting near her feet, then back up at her husband and asked him a single question in a voice so calm it unsettled him more than anger ever could have. She asked, "Did you bring a pen?" David, confused, asked her what she meant. Sarah told him she would be happy to sign whatever he needed signed, but that he should probably sit down first, because there were a few things about their marriage, and about the last 6 months in particular, that he clearly did not know. Over the next 20 minutes, and in a hospital room that should have been filled with nothing but joy, Sarah laid out, piece by piece, exactly what she knew. She told David about the messages with Claire Donovan. She told him the dates, the hotel locations, even quoted back to him, almost word for word, a message he had sent 8 months earlier about finally being honest with himself about his marriage. David's face, according to a nurse who was present briefly during this exchange and later described the scene to a colleague, went from confident to confused to something close to panic in the span of a single sentence. He started to speak, to explain, to deflect, the way men in his position often do. Sarah cut him off, gently but firmly, and told him none of that mattered anymore. What mattered now, she said, to her, was the timing of the very papers he had just placed at her feet. David, still standing at the foot of the bed, asked Sarah what she meant by timing, his voice noticeably less composed than it had been only minutes earlier. Sarah asked him calmly whether he had checked the news that morning. He told her he hadn't, that he had been with his attorney since before sunrise finalizing the filing. Sarah nodded slowly as though this confirmed something she already suspected, and told him that while he had been sitting in that office signing papers meant to end their marriage, her own attorneys had been 3 floors below him, closing a deal that would soon make headlines across the entire industry. David's expression, according to the nurse who witnessed this part of the exchange, shifted from confusion to something closer to dawning dread, in the particular look of a man beginning to realize, in real time, that he had badly misjudged the situation he believed he was controlling. This is the part of the story where we have to step back briefly and explain something most people watching this do not know about how prenuptial agreements and high-value business deals actually interact under the law, because it is the key to everything that happened next. When David's family attorneys drafted the prenup 6 years earlier, their entire focus had been protecting the Whitman family's existing wealth, the trust funds, the real estate, the inherited assets that predated the marriage. The agreement stated in fairly standard legal language that any business, intellectual property, or company built independently by either spouse during the marriage, while using that spouse's own labor and ideas, would remain the sole and separate property of the spouse who created it, regardless of the marriage's outcome. At the time, this clause existed purely to prevent Sarah from ever making a claim on anything connected to David's family trust. Nobody in that room 6 years earlier considered the possibility that Sarah might be the one building something extraordinary, and that David, ironically, would be the one with no claim to it. There was one more detail, the kind of detail that separates a sympathetic story from a genuinely shocking one. Patricia Reyes had structured Sarah's divorce filing to be submitted at almost the exact moment David's own filing was being processed by the courts, but with one critical difference in timing that David's legal team had completely failed to anticipate. Sarah's filing was time-stamped roughly 90 minutes after the manufacturing deal had officially and legally closed. That 90-minute gap meant the $1.5 billion transaction was indisputably finalized as Sarah's separate, independent property before the divorce proceedings began, eliminating any possible argument from David's side that the deal had been a marital asset subject to division. David, in his rush to file before what he called the emotional complications of the baby's arrival, had inadvertently filed his own papers at the worst possible moment, locking in, with his own signature, a financial outcome that worked entirely against him. News of the divorce, and shortly after, news of the massive business deal, began circulating within business circles almost simultaneously, although neither story initially mentioned the other. A trade publication broke the news of the manufacturing deal first, describing Sarah Whitman as, quote, a rising force in advanced materials manufacturing, without mentioning her personal life at all. It was a financial blogger scanning public court filings out of pure curiosity about a name he recognized from the deal coverage, who first connected the two stories together, publishing a short post simply titled, "Did this billionaire's husband really file for divorce the same day her company closed a $1.5 billion deal?" The post spread quickly. Within 48 hours, the story had migrated from finance forums to mainstream entertainment and business news, with headlines competing to capture just how stunning the timing truly was. Predictably, speculation ran in every possible direction. Some commentators assumed David had somehow known about the deal in advance and was attempting to file before the assets could be protected, a theory that fell apart quickly once court documents confirmed his filing arrived after the deal had legally closed. Others speculated that Sarah had orchestrated the entire timeline as calculated revenge, a theory that was closer to true than most people realized, though far more complicated than simple revenge. A handful of tabloid outlets reached out to Claire Donovan directly, who, according to two people familiar with the situation, initially believed David was already separated from Sarah when their relationship began, and was reportedly stunned to learn the full timeline once the story broke publicly. Whatever Claire Donovan believed or didn't believe, the public conversation increasingly settled on one central, almost folkloric question. How could a man married to someone building a fortune of that size have so completely failed to see what was right in front of him? Online discussion forums dedicated to business news spent weeks dissecting every available detail of the case, with amateur sleuths combing through public court filings, old social media posts, and even archived photos from charity galas the couple had attended together, searching for some earlier sign of what was coming. Several commentators pointed to old interview footage of David, recorded roughly 2 years before the divorce, in which he was asked about Sarah's company and responded, somewhat dismissively, that he, quote, didn't get too involved in the details, preferring to let Sarah, quote, pull or handle her little projects. That single clip resurfaced repeatedly throughout the news cycle, frequently captioned with some version of the same sentiment, that David's own dismissiveness had blinded him to the scale of what his wife was actually building, right up until it was legally and irreversibly too late for him to claim any part of it. Behind closed doors in conference rooms far quieter than the internet speculation suggested, David's attorneys were beginning to grasp the full weight of what their client had done. One attorney, speaking anonymously to a business publication months later, described the moment his firm fully understood the prenup's language and the deal's closing timestamp as, quote, the kind of mistake you study in law school for the next 20 years. David, for his part, he reportedly spent the first several weeks after the hospital confrontation in a state of disbelief, repeatedly asking his legal team to find some angle, some loophole, some argument that could undo what his own signature had already done. There wasn't one. The agreement his own family had insisted upon, designed entirely to protect a Whitman fortune from an outsider, had instead built an airtight wall around a fortune that outsider had built herself, with David standing fully outside it by his own hand, on the very day he thought he was finally taking control. As the legal proceedings moved forward in the months following their daughter's birth, a deeper truth began to surface, one that even some of Sarah's closest friends had not fully understood until it came out during deposition. David's legal team, are increasingly desperate to find any leverage in a case that was slipping further away from him, with each filing, attempted a final argument. They claimed Sarah had engaged in what they called deliberate financial concealment, suggesting she had hidden the existence and scale of the deal from David specifically to manipulate the divorce's timing and protect her assets unfairly. It was in some ways the most honest accusation David's team had made throughout the entire case, because it was almost entirely true. Sarah had concealed it. The only flaw in the argument was a legal one. Nothing in their marriage, their prenup, or the law required Sarah to disclose an independently built, separately owned business asset to a husband who had spent the better part of a year secretly building a life with another woman. During her deposition, Sarah was asked directly under oath why she had chosen to keep the deal completely private from David for so long. Her answer, according to two people present in the room that day, was delivered without hesitation and without a hint of theatrics. She said she had stopped sharing her professional life with David roughly 4 years into their marriage, after watching him repeatedly grow uncomfortable, dismissive, or subtly competitive whenever her work succeeded. She said she made the conscious decision to protect her business the same way you might protect a child from someone who has shown you, through their actions, that they cannot be trusted to handle something fragile with care. When David's attorney pressed her further, asking whether discovering his affair had influenced her decision to delay the divorce filing until the deal closed, Sarah paused for a long moment before answering. She said that discovering the affair had not changed her plans. It had simply confirmed that the plans she already had in place were the right ones. David's attorney, clearly searching for any thread that might shift the proceedings in his client's favor, then asked Sarah whether she felt any guilt about allowing David to believe their marriage was salvageable in the months leading up to the birth, while she privately knew it was already over. Sarah's answer, according to court transcripts later reviewed by several journalists covering the case, was measured and direct. She said she had not pretended the marriage was salvageable, while she said she had simply stopped discussing her inner life with a man who had already in practice stopped being honest with her, and that there was a meaningful difference between deception and quietly protecting herself from further harm. The judge presiding over the financial proceedings, according to one attorney present that day, made a brief notation in the margin of her copy of the transcript, visible only because it was later included in unsealed case documents. The notation read simply, "Self-protection is not the same as concealment." This is the detail that turned this story, in the eyes of many who followed it closely, from a tale of betrayal into something closer to a masterclass in patience. Sarah had not built her exit strategy in a moment of panic after finding those messages on the family calendar. She had been quietly, even methodically protecting her independence for years before that discovery, structuring her company's ownership, her contracts, and her financial life in ways that happened to align almost perfectly with the protections already buried inside David's own family's prenuptial agreement. The affair did not create Sarah's strategy. It simply removed any remaining hesitation she had about using it. Claire Donovan, for her part, found herself in an increasingly uncomfortable position as the case progressed. Once positioned as the woman David was building a future with, she reportedly distanced herself from him within weeks of the story breaking publicly, telling friends she had not fully understood the scope of David's financial situation, or the fact that the situation was rapidly becoming a very public, very humiliating legal battle. David, who had once told Claire that leaving Sarah would be simple and clean, found himself instead at the center of one of the most discussed divorce cases in recent business news. A man who had walked away not only from his marriage, but from any claim to one of the largest deals of the year, a deal he hadn't even known existed until headlines told him. The emotional turning point in the public's perception of this story came during a brief, unplanned moment outside the courthouse, captured by photographers covering the case. As Sarah left a hearing with her infant daughter in a carrier against her chest, a reporter shouted a question, asking whether she had any regrets about how everything unfolded. Sarah stopped, turned toward the small crowd of cameras, and said only this: "And I regret that he made me choose between protecting myself and trusting him. But I don't regret which one I chose." She then turned and walked to a waiting car without answering another question. The clip circulated widely within hours, and for many people watching from a distance, it crystallized something about the entire story that the legal documents and financial headlines never quite captured. This had never really been about money. It had been about a woman who had spent years being underestimated, finally being seen exactly as she was. There is one final detail in this story, one that did not become public until nearly a year after the divorce was finalized, and it might be the most quietly devastating piece of the entire timeline. During the financial disclosures required by the divorce proceedings, it was revealed that David, in the months before he filed, had taken out a private loan against a portion of his own family trust, intending to use the funds to start a new life with Claire Donovan, including a down payment on an apartment the two had been quietly touring together. The irony, which several financial commentators pointed out once the details surfaced, was almost unbearable. David had gone into debt preparing for a future with another woman, at the exact same time his wife was closing a deal that would have made that entire financial maneuver completely unnecessary had he simply still been someone she felt safe being honest with. He had spent money trying to leave a marriage he believed offered him nothing, on the very week his soon-to-be ex-wife became one of the wealthiest self-made women in her industry. David Whitman today, he works in a much smaller capacity at his father's firm. People who know him describe him as quieter than he used to be, less certain of himself in rooms where he once commanded easy confidence. Sarah Whitman, meanwhile, has become something of a quiet icon in business circles, often cited in interviews and profiles as an example of resilience, discretion, and the particular kind of strength that comes from surviving years of being underestimated by the person who should have known her best. She rarely discusses David publicly, When asked in a profile published roughly 18 months after their daughter's birth, what advice she would give to other women who suspect they are being underestimated in their own relationships, Sarah offered a single sentence that has since been quoted widely across business and lifestyle publications alike. She let them underestimate you. Just make sure you're the only one who knows how wrong they are. What does a story like this really tell us, beyond the shock of its timing and the satisfaction of its irony? Perhaps it is this. The people who hurt us rarely do so all at once. They do it slowly in small moments of dismissal, of distraction, of quietly making us feel smaller so they can feel larger. And sometimes the most powerful response to that slow erosion is not anger, and it is not even confrontation. Sometimes it is simply patience, the willingness to keep building quietly, keep protecting yourself fiercely, and wait for the moment when the truth can no longer be ignored, ridiculed, or taken from you. Was Sarah's silence in your eyes a form of strength, or did it cost her something she can never fully get back? And knowing everything you now know about that morning in room 412, would you have spotted the warning signs as early as Sarah did? Or would David's charm have fooled you too? If this story moved you, we want to hear from you. Tell us in the comments, honestly, what you would have done in Sarah's position. Would you have confronted David the moment you found those messages? Or would you have done exactly what she did and quietly built your own protection while the truth finished revealing itself? And if this story kept you on the edge of your seat, wait until you hear what happened in our next case. A story about a woman who discovered her husband's biggest secret was not another person at all, but a debt so enormous it threatened to take everything she had spent her life building. If you want more real stories of betrayal, resilience, wherein the quiet power of patience, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss the next one.